The name of my veteran is Doug Zaccanelli. He was born on August 12, 1949. He served in the Army, and his highest rank achieved was E4. This is conducted on May 22nd, 2017 in Caledonia, Michigan. My name is Seth Morse, and I know him through our church. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. I'm going to ask you the first question. What were your family details like? How many siblings do you have?
I have 4 siblings. There are 4 of us. I got an older brother and sister and a younger brother and sister. I was right in the middle. I have the middle child syndrome, whatever that is.
How were your parents? How would you describe them?
Working class, blue collar working class. Lived in a working class neighborhood. They were together, and grew up in a nice environment, happy family, happy home, happy childhood.
So where were you raised?
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Do you know any other family members who served in the military?
My father served in World War II. He was a belly gunner in a B-17 bomber. I have an uncle that was at the Battle of the Bulge in Europe in 1945. Or 44, would have been Christmas time, 1944. Various uncles that served, but those are the 2 I can remember offhand. None of my brothers served. I have one cousin that was in the Marine Corps. That's about it.
So did you enlist in the Army, or were you drafted?
I was drafted. I was abducted by a hostile government at the time. It was during the Nixon administration, and they were, how would you say, they were sending more and more troops to Vietnam, and myself and a lot of people, a lot of young men were drafted. Everybody in my draftee unit, my basic training unit, were all from my area, Wyoming, Michigan. And we were all drafted. We all got infantry, most of us, all but about 3 or 4 of us got infantry, and all of us got orders from Vietnam, for Vietnam.
So how was training at the camps when you first got there?
Basic training was at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and it was, like training. They were screaming at us and making us run, marching us all over the place, especially in the rain. But the food was good. Then after we got through basic training, they have advanced infantry training, or they call it advanced individual training. That was in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and that was a very unpleasant place. It was July, it was hot, and we survived it. But the food wasn't nearly as good, and we got orders from there to go to Vietnam after I think I had it was about an 18-day leave, of which I took, I think, 26 days.
Do you have any specific memories in training?
Not really. You made good friends, and the best time was after chow in the evening. You got to just hang out with your friends and, sit on the floor or out on the steps and just talk with each other and get to know each other and, form great bonds, a lot of friendships there.
So, how was the social and political life during that time?
Well, I was drafted on March 4th, 1969. that was the time. It was, you know, you had a lot of anti-war demonstrations. We watched the Vietnam War on the evening news. You know, during dinner time, you'd be sitting there watching, watching napalm, people get napalmed and firefights and stuff like that. So it wasn't a very popular war, and at that time, being a young man, you had a few choices for your life going after high school. You could get married and had kids. That would make you what they call an F4. In other words, you wouldn't get drafted. Then you could get drafted and definitely probably go to Vietnam and risk your life over there. Or you could go to Canada or go to jail. Or go to college, that's right. And if you didn't want to go to college or get married, you really had three choices. And I had those three choices. In fact, my dad being a veteran of war, and I want to stress this, that he was a veteran of the actual fighting in a war. When I got my draft notice or my greetings from President Nixon saying you're to report to Fort Wayne in Detroit, Michigan for induction into the U.S. military, my dad asked me, just looked at me, he says, "Are you going to go?" And I just looked at him and go, "Well, I got nothing else to do." I was working for the C&O Railroad at the time, that's the CSX now. And like I think many of us at that time, watching it on the news and hearing about it, having people come back and talking about it, and just curious. I want to go see what it's about. So I went.
What were your feelings when you were at Vietnam?
Well, I guess when I first got there, I was scared shitless. But that passes. You're always a little bit worried about what's going to happen, especially when the shooting started. But you get used to that, and my feelings were varied.
So what actions did you witness, like in combat?
Well, I was in a place called the Ashaw Valley. It was commonly known to the world and to people who watched the news back then. It's known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That was the main supply route from the north, Vietnam, the enemy, coming down a valley into South Vietnam, and that's where all their troop movements came in. That's where all their troops came in. That's where all their supplies come in that we didn't furnish for them. That's where the majority of them were, and they weren't just Viet Cong in there. There was North Vietnamese Army. So it was a pretty hot spot. It was, if you've heard of Hamburger Hill, that's where Hamburger Hill was. So there was quite a bit of troop movement in there, and we would go on long-range search and destroy missions for the enemy. I spent, out of the 365 days I spent in Vietnam, probably 300 of it was spent in the Ashaw Valley or their surrounding areas. And we humped every day. We put on our rucksacks, carried our food, water, and ammunition, and we went up and down the ridge lines and the trails, searching for the enemy. That's what we did. And at night we'd set up a perimeter and set out claymore mines and take turns posting guard and spend the night sleeping there in the bush. In the morning we'd eat breakfast and break camp, throw in our rucksacks and start humping again, looking for the enemy. That's all I did.
So did you have trouble spotting any Viet Cong?
Well, I guess what a lot of people don't realize is that these people have been fighting that war since the 40s. most of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong started fighting in that war when they were 12 or 13, old enough to carry a weapon or shoot a weapon. So we were like, they were vastly outgunned, but we were vastly outmaneuvered. It was guerrilla warfare. We were like the British invading, during the Revolutionary War, where they were marching around in these big ranks and stuff like that, and a couple of farmers would pick them off. That's pretty much what we faced. We were not trained nor equipped to fight a guerrilla war. It's that simple. We had our victories. We blew a lot of people and a lot of stuff up. But when it came right down to it, we got ran out of Vietnam.
So, did you contact your family and friends when you were there in Vietnam?
I wrote them. They wrote me. Called them a couple of times. Right now you have a cell phone. You can dial anywhere on Earth. In 1969, we had something they called it Mars, where you go to the certain spot in our divisional base camp, and you go there and you could call home, but it was literally you called landline to the West Coast, and they patched you through to somebody else, which passed you through to somebody else to patch you through to your home, and you're talking to your folks, and it was just a marvel. It was like, wow, you called home from Vietnam? Impossible, but we did it.
I know this is a pretty nasty question, but did you kill anyone there?
I don't know.
Kind of just shot wherever?
I don't know.
Did you feel like you have changed after the war?
Oh yeah, big time.
How so?
Just changes you. I thought different than my brothers and sisters. I thought different than before I got drafted. I still think differently than other people. You see things and you do things that, most people don't get to do or don't have to do. I would say they don't get to do them.
So was readjustment going back to the United States after the war, was it pretty hard for you or was it pretty easy?
At first it was very hard. I had what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, although back in 1969 they hadn't labeled it yet. Basically we were considered either you had shell shock or you couldn't adjust to civilian life. But I got through it. I was taught some mental discipline techniques and overcame it on my own. And I teach those mental discipline techniques at the VA hospital in Battle Creek. I've been doing it for about 10 years for veterans, and helped a lot of them fully recover from their PTSD. I've had Vietnam veterans come up to me after 40 years of suffering with depression and PTSD, and after practicing what I teach them for a couple of weeks, come to me and say, I can't believe it was that freaking simple.
Do you have any specific stories of that?
I've got tons of them. I mean, I've been doing it for 10 years. I teach it to people too. I teach people it every week, and I can honestly say that I probably helped hundreds overcome their PTSD. Some stories related to that. I had one guy that he sat and wept through my whole class the whole time he was there. I mean, he just tears this whole time. And he told me that he'd been crying ever since he got home from I take that back. He'd been crying for about 4 or 5 months, constantly weeping. He says, when I first got home from Iraq, he says, all I did is drank and drank and drank. And I stayed drunk because I couldn't deal with what I had to deal with. He says, and then finally I quit drinking. I had to quit drinking. But I keep, and So, and as soon as I quit drinking, these things started really getting to me again. He says, all I've been doing is weeping. And he sat through my class, and I told him, I says, you know, I promise him, I says, if you do this exercise, this structured mental discipline that I teach, and it's called being still, from the Bible, be still and know. I taught it to him, and I promised him, just like I promised all these guys, if you do this, I promise you'll get better. And he came back the next week. Of course, he was, you know, down there for a duration, for a while. He come back the next week, and he was still weeping. Of course, it doesn't work that fast. And I said, did you do it? He says, I can't do it. I goes, why not? He says, I can't close my eyes, because when I close my eyes, I have those thoughts and those visions. Remember, it's just coming, just attack me. I says, you don't have to close your eyes, just pick a spot on the wall and do the exercise. He goes, okay. And so he left. That was his last week there. And that was in February a few years ago. When he come back in July, and I didn't recognize him. He goes, after class, I always say, any questions or comments? And he raises his hand. He says, can I say something? I go, yeah. And he goes, you know who I am? And I go, you look familiar, but I've seen a lot of guys, you know. He says, I was the one that wept through every class, both those classes when I was here. I goes, okay. He says, I remember you now. I said, you look pretty good. He says, yeah. He says, can I say something to the class? I go, yeah. He says, he got up, turned around, and he looked at everybody. He says, I want to tell you what this dude's teaching you absolutely works. He says, I spent weeks doing it, and the only reason I kept doing it is because he promised me if I do it, I'd get better. And I don't know how long it took, but I noticed I wasn't crying anymore. And then after a while, I thought more about life and living than I was thinking about the stuff that happened to me. He says, and since then, I just got totally better. I got a ton of stories like that.
So, how did the wartime experience affected your life?
Well,
You kind of already explained a lot of it, but...
yeah, I guess, I think part of it is that, you know, people who haven't experienced war look at life in a certain way. You know, they're concerned about different things. Where somebody, I think, you know, when you've been through that sort of thing, and you know, you see some friends get blown away and stuff like that, you kind of look at life differently. Like, in a way, you're a lot more serious about certain things and not serious about others, okay? Like, you know, I can't tell you how many times I walked away from a job just because I didn't want to do it anymore. It was not worth it to me to sit there and suffer through this daily grind and putting up with certain people that I didn't want to deal with anymore. So, you know, I'd turn around and just walk out. And I think that, you know, that's, they want to attribute that to PTSD, but I think it's just plain makes sense to me, you know. Why would I, you know, if I got somebody that's being a jerk, and I got to deal with him, and he's over me or something like that. I mean, when I was in the Army, I had to put up with that, or go to jail, you know. In the civilian life, I don't have to put up with that at all, you know, and I never did. So.
What life lessons could be learned, or what people could learn from life lessons that you learned at Vietnam with your military service?
I don't know. I remember I had a restaurant. Actually, I had three restaurants down around Western Michigan University's campus. Sergeant Pepperoni's is what I called them. They were pizza and sub shops, and one Italian restaurant. And I was in there late one night, and it was right during the first Gulf War. And it was right about the time that it came out in the press that they were considering drafting people, you know. And I had all these college young men working for me, and in the kitchen, you know, they're cooking pizza and working and stuff, and they're all getting paranoid, worried they were going to get drafted. And they knew that I'd been in Vietnam. They knew that I wasn't for that war. I thought it was a lot like every other war, except World War I and II. And they said, well, what do you think? And I go, well, what I think is that if I were you, I'd try to get down to that recruiting station and sign up and get over there into that war while there's still some excitement going on, you know, because in about 5 years you're going to be married, have a couple of kids and a mortgage to worry about, and this is your last chance for any kind of adventure in your life. And they all looked at me like I was nuts, but that's a reality, you know. And I don't think anybody should sign up to go to war unless that's what they want to do. I think the guys that are signing up now, they go to war because they want to be warriors. And I think those are the only people that should do that. The rest of us ought to stay home and go to college and raise a family.
What would you say to the people in this generation, what they should have learned to learn from the Vietnam War? I think
this generation and about the last 3 generations, including the generation of the Vietnam War, from the Vietnam War, during the Vietnam War, we had all kinds of protesters. We had all kinds of people saying against that war. But the minute that the draft stopped, the anti-war protests started dropping off, you know. And then everybody went for themselves. They went and got their degrees and stuff and started making money and not paying attention to what's going on in Washington. And what's going on in Washington right now today is what we're paying for because nobody's paying attention. Nobody's really tuned into what they're doing to this country. That's my feeling. Some people think that what's going on in this country is good. I think it is good too, but I think that people need to educate themselves in the same way that people in other countries educate themselves about what's going on politically.
All right. We ask you, thank you for your service in Vietnam.
Thank you.
Thankful that you could be here for this interview. I'm going to shut it off now.
Okay.